The iron bars clanged shut behind me, and for the first time in my life, I felt utterly powerless. The cold, suffocating air of the holding cell wrapped around me like a vice, and the accusations echoing in my head were louder than the guard's footsteps fading into the distance. I was in jail, not because I'd committed some heinous crime or broken the law. No, I was here because of her. Rachel, my ex-wife, the woman who once vowed to stand by me through thick and thin, had now turned my life into a waking nightmare. And the worst part? She wasn't just ruining me. She was using our child as a weapon to destroy me completely, or so I thought. The court hearing had been a disaster. Rachel stood there in her perfectly pressed dress, crocodile tears streaming down her face as she painted me as the deadbeat dad who refused to pay child support for our 7-year-old son, Ben. The judge looked at me like I was scum, a man who would rather spend his money on himself than take care of his own flesh and blood. My protests fell on deaf ears. Every word I said was twisted. Every explanation turned into another reason to hate me. And Rachel? She played her part beautifully. She hasn't had money for school supplies in months? She sobbed, clutching a tissue. I had to borrow from my sister just to buy him shoes. He's been asking why his daddy doesn't love him anymore. The courtroom gasped. The judge's glare intensified. My lawyer tried to intervene, but it was like throwing pebbles into a hurricane. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell, "That's not true," because it wasn't. Every cent I earned went straight to Rachel, even after our divorce. The truth was, Rachel had been spending the money on herself. Lavish spa days, designer handbags, and weekends at luxury resorts with her friends. But she was a master manipulator. She knew exactly how to play the victim, and she had everyone fooled. Everyone but me. By the end of the hearing, the gavel slammed down, and my fate was sealed. 6 months in jail for unpaid child support. 6 months to think about how I'd let Rachel destroy me. 6 months to plot my revenge. But something about her testimony didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about Ben. Our marriage had been rocky for years, filled with fights and lies, and Rachel had always been secretive about certain parts of her life. The nagging thought that had haunted me for months now grew louder and louder. What if Ben wasn't mine? It seemed impossible. Rachel and I had been together for years before he was born. But there were moments, little things I ignored at the time, that now screamed for my attention. The late-night phone calls she always took in the other room. The way she avoided my questions about her business trips. The time I found a man's jacket in the back of her car, and she laughed it off, saying it belonged to her brother. I couldn't ignore the doubts any longer. I needed proof. The first week in jail was hell, but it gave me clarity. I contacted my lawyer and begged him to file a motion for a paternity test. He was hesitant at first, but I insisted. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs, I told him. I need to know the truth. It took weeks to get the court to agree to the test. Weeks of sitting in that cell, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if my life was built on a lie. And then, one morning, the guard slid a folded piece of paper under my cell door. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The words blurred together at first, but one sentence stood out like a knife to the chest. Probability of paternity, 0%. Ben wasn't mine. The words on that paper felt like a cannonball to my chest. 0%. Ben wasn't my son. My knees buckled, and I sat on the cold cement floor of the cell, staring at the letter. I read it again and again, hoping it would somehow change, that I'd misunderstood. But the result was clear, indisputable. Every memory of Ben flashed through my mind like a cruel slideshow. His first steps, his first words, the way he'd call me Daddy, with a smile that could light up the darkest day. I had raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him, and now I knew he wasn't mine. My world crumbled into ashes. But with the heartbreak came anger, a blazing, all-consuming rage that made my hands shake and my vision blur. Rachel had lied to me for 7 years. She had built an entire life on deceit, and when it wasn't enough, she'd gone further, dragging me through court, ruining my reputation, and throwing me in jail for a child that wasn't even mine. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. I clenched the paper in my fist, crumpling it as the anger boiled over. This wasn't just about the lies anymore. Rachel had stolen years of my life. She'd used me, manipulated me, and then tossed me aside like garbage. But I wasn't going to let her win. No, this was just the beginning. The next few days in jail passed in a blur. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of exposing Rachel for the fraud she was. I didn't want just justice. I wanted her to feel the pain she'd inflicted on me 100-fold. When I finally got a call with my lawyer, I could barely keep my voice steady. "We have the paternity results," I said. "Now I want her destroyed." My lawyer hesitated. "What are you planning?" "Just file the appeal to overturn the child support order," I said coldly. "I'll handle the rest." It didn't take long for the motion to be filed. With the DNA test as evidence, the court had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. The ruling was overturned, and the charges against me were dropped. I was a free man, but walking out of that jail didn't feel like freedom. Not yet. Not until Rachel paid for what she'd done. Rachel's silence hung in the air like a ticking time bomb. Her lips quivered as if searching for a way to spin her web of lies. But for once, I had her cornered. There was no escaping this. No excuses. No crocodile tears could save her now. "Answer me," I thundered, slamming the crumpled DNA results onto the kitchen counter. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you known Ben isn't mine?" She flinched at my tone, her carefully constructed mask cracking. I wasn't sure," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Wasn't sure," I spat, leaning in closer. "You mean to tell me you had doubts about who Ben's father was and just decided to keep me in the dark? To bleed me dry while you played house with another man's child?" Her eyes darted to the floor, avoiding my gaze. "It wasn't like that," she muttered. You thought what?" I roared. "That I'd never find out? That you could use me forever while pretending to be some perfect mother? God! Rachel, do you even realize what you've done?" Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I did what I had to do," she snapped, her voice sharpening. "You think it was easy, raising Ben on my own while you were too busy with your job to notice anything? I gave him a life, stability, something you could never provide." I froze, stunned by her audacity. "Stability," I echoed, my voice low and venomous. "You mean lying to me for 7 years, stealing my money, and dragging me to court to throw me in jail? That's your idea of stability? You don't understand," she hissed, her tone turning defensive. "I didn't have a choice. I had to do what was best for Ben." "What's best for Ben?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Ben doesn't even know who his real father is. Does he? All these years, you've let him believe I was his dad. You've lied to him, too." Her silence was deafening. For the first time, Rachel looked genuinely shaken, as if the weight of her deceit was finally starting to sink in. But I wasn't done. "Who is he?" I demanded. "Ben's real father. Who is he?" "Rachel." She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It doesn't matter," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It matters to me," I shouted, slamming my fist on the counter. "It matters to Ben. You can't keep hiding this. Tell me the truth, or I swear I'll find out myself." Her eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or desperation. But then she crossed her arms and straightened her back, her expression hardening. "Fine," she said coldly. "You want the truth? It's Greg." The name hit me like a freight train. Greg, my former best friend. The man who had been a groomsman at our wedding. The man I had trusted with everything. "You're lying," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "Please tell me you're lying." She shook her head, her face pale. "I'm not," she said quietly. "Greg and it just happened. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my fists clenching at my sides. You call 7 years of lies a mistake? Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she sobbed. I thought you'd leave, that we'd get divorced, but you stayed. And I didn't know what to do. Don't you dare try to make me the villain here, I said through gritted teeth. This is on you, Rachel. You destroyed our marriage. You destroyed my life. And now you've destroyed any chance Ben had of growing up with the truth. She tried to reach for me, her voice trembling. Please, you have to understand. I never meant to hurt you. I stepped back, glaring at her with all the hatred I could muster. Don't touch me, I said, my voice cold as ice. You don't get to play the victim anymore. Her hand dropped to her side, and for a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything crashing down around us. But I wasn't done. Not yet. You've taken everything from me, I said, my voice steady but filled with venom. But I'm taking it all back. You're going to pay for what you've done, Rachel. I promise you that. Before she could respond, I turned and walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The anger boiling inside me was a fire I couldn't extinguish. But it also gave me clarity. Rachel thought she could destroy me, but she was wrong. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. I drove aimlessly for hours after storming out of Rachel's house. The revelation about Greg had thrown me into a spiral of anger and disbelief. He wasn't just my best friend, he was like a brother to me. We'd grown up together, shared every milestone, and even supported each other through our toughest moments. Now I knew that all those years of loyalty and trust had meant nothing to him. By the time I pulled into a quiet, empty parking lot, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as my mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Rachel had taken everything from me. My trust, my freedom, and my sense of identity. But the fight wasn't over. If she thought I was going to slink away quietly, she was dead wrong. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. There was one thing Rachel hadn't counted on. Her lies weren't airtight. She thought she had buried the truth, but she'd underestimated me. I had something she didn't resolve. I wouldn't stop until her world came crashing down just like she'd done to mine. The next day, I started putting my plan into action. First, I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal. Who else had she lied to? Who else had been complicit in her web of deceit? I decided to start with Greg. If he thought he could stab me in the back and get away with it, he was in for a rude awakening. Finding him wasn't hard. Greg had a predictable routine. Work at the construction firm during the day and drinks at his favorite bar after hours. I parked outside the bar that evening, watching as he walked in, laughing with a couple of his buddies. It sickened me to see him so carefree, as if he hadn't turned my life upside down. I waited until he was alone at the bar, nursing his drink. Then I walked in. The moment our eyes met, the smug smile on his face vanished. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Josh," he stammered, setting down his beer. "What are you doing here?" I didn't sit down. I didn't need to. The cold fury in my eyes was enough to pin him to his stool. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low and steady. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape. "Look, man, save it." I cut him off. "You've already said enough to Rachel, haven't you?" The color drained from his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." I leaned in, keeping my voice calm but dripping with venom. 7 years, Greg. 7 years of lies. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? He swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered. "It was a mistake." "Don't you dare use that word," I snapped. "You didn't just make a mistake, Greg. You built an entire life on betrayal. You're worse than Rachel." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might try to deny it. But then he sighed, slumping back in his chair. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. "I swear, Josh, I didn't want this to happen." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Didn't want it to happen? You slept with my wife. You fathered her child. And then you stood by and let me raise him as my own. You let me go to jail for child support. And you didn't want this to happen? He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. No, I don't want your excuses. I want answers. What do you want to know? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. There were so many questions swirling in my mind, but one stood out above the rest. Did you ever love her? Or was she just some sick game to you? Greg hesitated, his eyes filled with regret. I loved her, he admitted. But I didn't mean for it to go this far. You thought you could keep it a secret forever. I finished for him. Well, guess what, Greg? The secret's out. And you're going to pay for what you've done. I turned and walked away before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but my resolve had never been stronger. Greg's confession had confirmed what I already knew. He and Rachel were both snakes, but they'd underestimated me. After leaving the bar, my mind raced with everything Greg had admitted. His words replayed in my head like a broken record. I loved her. He didn't even deny it. For 7 years, he had been the shadow in my life, stealing what wasn't his, while I played the fool. But no more. I knew confronting Rachel wasn't enough. She needed to face the full consequences of her lies. Not just with me, but with everyone she had manipulated. And Greg wasn't off the hook either. If they thought they could destroy my life and walk away unscathed, they were in for a rude awakening. The first thing I did the next morning was meet with my lawyer. Sitting across from him in his neatly organized office, I laid out everything I'd learned. I don't just want to clear my name, I told him. I want them both exposed. I want the court, their families, and everyone they've lied to know the truth. He leaned back in his chair, his brows furrowed in thought. It's possible, he said, but it's going to take work. We'll need to reopen the case and file motions to bring everything to light. And this will get messy. I stared him down. Messy is fine. They've dragged me through the mud already. I'm just returning the favor. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal filings and evidence gathering. My lawyer subpoenaed financial records, text messages, and anything that could prove the extent of Rachel's deception. What we uncovered was worse than I could have imagined. Not only had Rachel lied about Ben's paternity, but she had also been funneling money from our joint accounts during our marriage. Money that I had earned. She used it to fund her lavish lifestyle and, as I suspected, her so-called business trips with Greg. The financial trail was damning, but what really sealed the deal was a series of messages between Rachel and Greg. In them, they openly discussed their affair, their plans to keep me in the dark, and even how they'd used the court system to squeeze more money out of me. One message from Rachel sent my blood boiling. Josh will never find out. He's too naive. Just let me handle him. The nerve of her. She had played me for a fool. But now, I had everything I needed to expose her. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. Rachel, as always, looked the part of the innocent victim. Dressed in a modest outfit, her face carefully made up to seem sympathetic. Greg sat in the back, trying to appear invisible, but I caught his nervous glances every time the door opened. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up, the evidence folder in my hands feeling heavier than it should. I looked Rachel straight in the eye as I began. For years, I believed I was Ben's father, I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. I loved him, raised him, and did everything I could to provide for him. But all that time, my ex-wife knew the truth, and she kept it from me. The judge's eyebrows raised slightly, but he gestured for me to continue. I have proof, I said, handing over the DNA results. Ben is not my biological son, but it doesn't stop there. I also have evidence that Rachel and Greg, my former best friend, conspired to hide this from me while using my money to support their affair. I handed over the text messages and financial records, watching as the judge flipped through them. Rachel's face turned ashen, her confident demeanor crumbling with every passing second. I've been lied to, manipulated, and wrongfully imprisoned for unpaid child support. I continued. But today, I'm here to set the record straight. I want this court to see the truth about the kind of person Rachel really is. Rachel finally spoke, her voice shaking. Your Honor, this is a personal attack. He's twisting the facts to make me look bad. The judge held up a hand to silence her. The evidence speaks for itself, Mrs. Turner. Do you have anything to say in your defense? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed at a loss. The judge ruled in my favor, overturning the child support order and declaring that Rachel and Greg had acted in bad faith. But the court's decision was just the beginning of their downfall. News of the case spread quickly, especially after I shared the truth with our mutual friends and family. Rachel's carefully curated image of the perfect mother shattered overnight. Her friends distanced themselves, her social circle evaporated, and even her own family expressed disgust at what she'd done. Greg didn't fare much better. He was fired from his job after his boss caught wind of the scandal, and his marriage, yes, he was married, fell apart when his wife discovered his affair with Rachel. As for me, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders for the first time in years. But I wasn't done yet. Rachel and Greg had taken so much from me, and now it was time to rebuild my life and make sure they never hurt anyone else again. With the court's ruling behind me, I focused on the most important part of my revenge, ensuring Ben knew the truth without causing him unnecessary pain. I met with him in a quiet park, away from the chaos. He was confused, understandably, but I kept my tone gentle. Ben, I said, I love you and that will never change, but there's something we need to talk about. I explained the situation in a way he could understand, emphasizing that none of this was his fault. He cried, and so did I. But in the end, we hugged, and I promised him I'd always be there for him, even if I wasn't his biological father. Rachel tried to reach out to me after that, begging for forgiveness, offering excuses, but I blocked her number. She had taken enough of my time and energy. I was done. Looking back, I realized that the betrayal could have broken me, but instead it made me stronger. Rachel and Greg underestimated me, but in the end, I proved that no amount of lies could keep the truth buried forever. And as for Rachel and Greg, they're left picking up the pieces of their shattered lives, while I'm finally free to move forward.